Hi there, and thank you for joining me for today's live reading of Detective Dylan and the Thief of Camp Leaf by M.J. Murray, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1: The Place with No Wi-Fi. 8-year-old Dylan helped his 5-year-old sister, Emily. He wrapped the cracker around the marshmallow and chocolate. Careful, Dylan said. It's still hot. Emily grinned but didn't say anything. She was busy eating the s'more. Their dog, Theodore, lay under Emily's chair, licking crumbs off the ground. He wiggled his stubby tail as he stared at the food. Dylan snagged a marshmallow for himself and stuck it on the stick. They had been at Camp Leaf with their family for 3 days. Roasting marshmallows, even if it was lunchtime instead of nighttime, was the most fun he'd had. The trip had been filled with rain and bugs. They hadn't swum in the lake yet, and the camp games hadn't started. Worst of all, there was no Wi-Fi. There hadn't even been a mystery for Dylan to solve. Dylan had brought his detective kit, just in case. He'd gotten it earlier in the summer. It was from his favorite show, The Youth Sleuths. Dylan pinned his Youth Sleuths detective badge to his shirt every morning, just like a real detective. He carried his detective kit on an old tool belt around his waist on every hike, just like a real detective. Emily had even been allowed to be his helper. So far, they'd only been able to ask questions like, when will the rain end? And what kind of bug was that? Today was the first dry day. The clouds blocked out the sun. Dylan had been so bored that he'd volunteered to help the campground owner, Mrs. Fan, paint the winter stand. Before he painted, the stand was white. Afterward, it was still white. This didn't make any sense to Dylan. The stand looked just fine before he painted it. Mrs. Fan sure seemed happy, though, about the paint job. She had said it was part of the surprise for the Camp Leaf games. Emily dropped a sticky hand to Theodore. He helped her clean up the marshmallow bits stuck to her fingers. Who do you think will win the games? Emily asked. I don't know, Dylan said. Riley said she got second place last year. Emily grinned. Riley is fast. If the games include running, she's sure to win. I suppose she might, said Dylan, but with the Benny brothers here, who knows what will happen? Emily frowned at the Benny brothers across the campfire. They had shown up late, like always. The brothers, Austin and Miles, were not her favorite. They were fourth-grade twins who pranked other kids. Austin and Miles were always in trouble. Just then, Mrs. Fan stood up. All right, everyone, Mrs. Fan said. This weekend, you're in for a real treat. We have several games planned, starting with a few special ones tonight. She waved her hands at everyone. Anyone under the age of 12 can play. Each game will give points for the top players. At the end, the winner will receive a Camp Leaf golden trophy. Follow me. Mrs. Fan marched down the path and toward the winner's stand. Dylan and Emily followed the group, tugging Theodore along on his leash. On the stand was a lump, covered by a large napkin. Mrs. Fan lifted the napkin with a whoosh to show the trophy. Everyone gasped. Under the napkin was a large, moss-covered rock. Chapter 2: The Know-It-All. Emily scrunched her nose. That trophy is nice, Emily said. That's not the trophy, Mrs. Fan said. The trophy has vanished. The Benny brothers laughed. Maybe someone decided the Camp Leaf game should be canceled this year? One of them asked. Mrs. Fan ignored the boys. She stepped behind the stand. I don't see the trophy anywhere, she said. Excuse me, Dylan said. Are you planning to do the Camp Leaf games today? Mrs. Fan said, We need the trophy back first. Emily tugged on Mrs. Fan's sleeve. Maybe we can help you. My brother is a detective and I'm his helper. Mrs. Fan frowned. I'm not sure about that. We've solved cases before, Dylan said. What would it hurt if we looked around, asked a few questions? Mrs. Fan said. Okay, but I don't want you bothering any of the campers who are here. They come here to relax. Dylan jumped with excitement. We won't let you down, Mrs. Fan, he said. Come on, Emily, let's search for clues. Hold on, said Mrs. Fan. I'd like my granddaughter to go with you. She'll make sure you don't upset anyone. Paige? Paige, over here, dear. A girl about Dylan's age stepped forward. She used a finger to push her large glasses up her nose. Her frizzy hair blew across her face. Theodore tugged on his leash. The girl reached out to pet him, and he fell over onto the ground. His tongue hung out of his mouth. Paige, keep these detectives out of trouble, will you? Mrs. Fan asked as she walked away. So, what are you two planning to do? Paige asked. Dylan rolled his eyes. What wouldn't he do? His kit had everything. Maybe I'll dust for prints, said Dylan, or I'll ask questions to see if anyone saw anything. Emily walked to the stand. Did you paint this today? Emily asked. Dylan nodded. Not that you can tell. It's the same as it was before. Paige shrugged. She said, That's what you think. It's not what I think. It's what I know. It was white before, and it's white now, said Dylan with a sigh. Paige stepped away from Theodore. He whimpered and raised a paw at her. It's glow-in-the-dark paint. Of course it looks normal right now. The sun hasn't set yet, Paige said. Dylan raised an eyebrow. He unsnapped a tube from his belt and pressed a button. This is a UV flashlight, Dylan said. If the paint is glow-in-the-dark, this will show it. Dylan pointed the flashlight at the stand. Sure enough, it glowed. Can I try? Emily asked. Dylan handed Emily the flashlight. She pointed it at the top of the stand and along the sides, then along the ground. Theodore watched with interest for a moment before chewing on his paw. Wait, Dylan said. Go back. Point the flashlight over there again. Emily moved the light slowly this time. As the light moved along the ground, they saw glowing bits. A shoe print here, a line there. Could it be? Emily asked. What if the paint was still wet when the trophy was taken? These might be the thief's shoe prints. That's it. We can follow these tracks right to the thief's campsite, said Dylan. Dylan used the light to search along the path, looking for glowing spots of paint. Not gonna work, said a voice next to him. Dylan looked up to see that Paige had followed him. Her glasses had slipped down her nose again. How come? Emily asked. Paige said, You two haven't read the Camp Leaf history handout. The camp has 50 tent sites, 100 camper sites, and 20 cabins. A connection of 3 miles of paved paths gives the thief too many choices for us to follow on tracks alone. I'm the detective, Dylan said. I'll decide if it will work or not. Dylan sped forward, not bothering to ask if they were going to follow. Chapter 3. The Artist. Dylan raced down the path. He used his flashlight to follow the tracks. Well, what was left of the tracks? It was getting harder and harder to spot the trail. Paige was right. He couldn't see any more glow paint. Dylan slowed to a walk. He didn't look at Paige. Camp Leaf has been open every summer since 1965, Paige said. Every year the family does the Camp Leaf game for kids. I don't see how those details help us, said Dylan. We're looking for a trophy thief. Emily caught up, gasping. Tugging Theodore down the path was hard work. Maybe Paige can help us, Emily said. It sounds like she knows more about the campground than we do. Dylan asked, but does she know as much about detective work as we do? Paige laughed. Of course not, she added. I prefer to learn about important stuff. Dylan groaned. Emily looked from Dylan to Paige. This was fun. Normally, she was the one annoying Dylan. Emily grinned and said slyly, I think I'd like to hear more about the Camp Leaf games. Paige grinned. Well, she said, it all began with the egg spoon race when the camp opened. It became so popular that soon the games included 8 different activities. The water balloon toss is my favorite. There's also the tug of war, fishing, slingshot targets, juggling, and the scavenger hunt. Lastly, there's the talent show. That sounds fun, Emily said. I hope they still start the games today. They will, Dylan said. We just need to get the trophy back to Mrs. Fan. They walked slowly down the path. Dylan didn't spot any more tracks. Theodore chased a pine cone that Emily rolled down the path with her shoe. A friendly voice called out, Dylan, Emily, is that you? They turned to see their friend Jack standing next to a camper. Hi, Jack, said Dylan. You're here too? He played with the UV flashlight, clicking it on and off. Sure am, said Jack. Just got in today. I was too late for s'mores, but luckily we had some snacks back here I could eat. Paige walked up to them as Jack ducked down to pet Theodore. Dylan clicked the flashlight on. He clicked it back off. On, off, on, wait. What was that? Dylan turned the flashlight back on. There. On the bottoms of Jack's shoes was glow-in-the-dark paint. Dylan poked Emily to get her attention. When she looked, Dylan put a finger to his lips. He didn't want her to say anything.